Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to this third lecture in our class, The Modern Novel. Today, inshallah, I will be talking to you about the emergence and the evolution of the novel. So, the novel has a long history by now. It stretches over 200 or 300 years, and it has gone through some developments, and new schools have arrived and new traditions have emerged. So in this lecture I want to give you an overview of this development from the emergence to the present. We start first with the pioneers of the novel, the people who first started developing the form of the novel. We have people like Samuel Richardson, who was born in 1689 and died in 1761. He was born in the late 17th century and died in the second half of the 18th century. He wrote novels like Pamela in 1740 and Clarissa. His style, he wrote novels that are classified as epistolary, meaning that they are in the form of letter writing. They're also sentimental. Some of them are morality tales, stories of servants, for example, resisting seduction by her employer or something like that. Next, important novelists in the early generations is Henry Fielding. He was born in 1707, so that's the beginning of the 18th century, and died in 1754, in almost the second half of the 18th century. He wrote Shamela in 1741, Joseph Andrews in 1742, and Tom Jones in 1741. His novels are comic epics in prose, in a way. This is how they are described. They are epics, but they are comical, and they're in prose. Sometimes he also parodies Richardson. He parodies Samuel Richardson's novels. Another important tradition that developed in the first 100-200 years of the novel is the novel of manners, and the most famous novelist in this tradition is, of course, Jane Austen. Her novels are dominated by the customs, manners, and conventional behavior and habits of a particular social class. That's why they're called the novel of manners, because it portrays a society in its cultural environment and describes in details its manners and its customs. It is often concerned with courtship and with marriage, so there's always sentimental stories in these novels. It is realistic, sometimes it's satirical, and it focuses on domestic society rather than the larger world. So the concern in the novel of manners is usually on the domestic society, on domestic families, on domestic issues and things like that, rather than the larger world. Other novelists of manners that can be cited, people like Anthony Trollope, Edith Wharton, Scott Fitzgerald, and Margaret Drabble. Of course, also we have to mention the important tradition of the Gothic novel. These are novels that are characterized by magic, mystery, and horror. They usually have an exotic setting, either medieval or oriental, but it's usually an exotic setting. So the setting is usually either in the medieval period or it's in an oriental, land where everything seems exotic. The Gothic novel originated with Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto in 1764, and then with William Beckford Vadek and An Arabian Tale in 1786. Anne Radcliffe wrote 5 novels, including The Mysteries of Udolpho. They're all classified as Gothic novel. They were widely populated, they were widely popular throughout Europe and America, and to name today, for example, they still remain popular today, and contemporary Gothic novelists include people like Anne Rice or Stephen King, the famous Stephen King. One of the most famous of these novels is, of course, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. She was born in 1797 and died in 1851. It's one of the most famous Gothic novels of all time, Frankenstein. It's inspired by a dream in reaction to a challenge to write a ghost story. So Mary Shelley apparently had a dream, and in the dream she saw a challenge to write a ghost story, so she wrote Frankenstein. It was published in 1817, the second decade of the 19th century, and it's influenced by the Greek myth of Prometheus. Of course, this is a famous Greek myth, and Mary Shelley, in a way, incorporates the story of the Greek myth of Prometheus into the story of Frankenstein, and models it on the myth. Frankenstein is also considered the first science fiction novel. Another important novel tradition of the novel is the novels of sentiment. They're sentimental stories. These basically are novels in which the characters, and thus the readers, have a heightened emotional response to events, right? So the events are presented in a heightened emotional manner, and the reader is also encouraged to have a heightened emotional response to these events. They're connected to basically the Romantic movement, which was emerging at this time. Some of the most important names in the novel of sentiment are people like novelists like Lawrence Sterne, his famous novel Tristram Shandy, written between 1760 and 1767. Notice here we are in the second half of the 18th century, so of the 18th century. People like Johann Wolfgang Goethe, the German novelist Goethe, his novel, for example, The Sorrows of Young Werther, written in 1774. It's also considered one of the famous novels of sentiment. In France, the most important writers of the novel of sentiment were people like Chateaubriand, François René de Chateaubriand. He wrote Atala in 1801 and René in 1802. In England, of course, we have the Brontes, the Bronte sisters, Anne Bronte, who wrote Agnes Grey in 1847, Emily Bronte, who wrote Wuthering Heights in 1847, and Charlotte Bronte, who wrote Jane Eyre in 1847. Of course, we have also to not to mention the important historical novel, that basically reconstruct a past age. They take an episode from the past and try to reconstruct it in a story form, and often present two cultures in conflict or something of the sort. They present fictional characters that interact with historical figures in actual events. The most famous writers of the historical novel is Walter Scott. He was born in 1771 and died in 1832. So he lived in the last half of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century. He is considered the father of the historical novel. His most famous historical novels include the Waverley novels and, of course, Ivanhoe, which was published in 1819. Of course, there is also, in the development of the novel, this is the time when the novel develops a full-fledged tradition of realism. Unlike poetry and drama, the novel is written in prose, and unlike poetry and drama, the novel deals with everyday life characters. So the heroes in the novel and the characters are not necessarily aristocrats or kings or princes, and most of the time they are average everyday life or middle class people. The episodes and the challenges of these heroes that they go through are usually simple everyday life stories. The style is usually journalistic in style. Indeed, even the novel emerged. The first novel writers were people who used to be journalists and started writing novels using the journalistic story, journalistic style. So eventually the novel developed a full-fledged tradition of realism, and the realism probably found the biggest home that the tradition of realism found was indeed in the novel, more so than in poetry or drama. And then after realism, there developed naturalism, and a lot of people have difficulty separating realism from naturalism. They're almost identical, but they have a lot of similarities, but they have also some differences. So I want to give you a brief distinction between these two stylistic movements, these two traditions of the novel, the realist novel and the naturalist novel. So the realist novel usually deals with middle class people. The naturalist novel deals with middle or lower class people. The realist novel is usually pragmatic, but naturalism is usually scientific. Realism usually deals with psychological issues. Naturalism usually deals with sociological issues. Perhaps the best way to distinguish between the two is that naturalism tries to pursue realism to a scientific level, like almost the novelist becomes like a scientific lens that tries to capture reality almost as it is in a scientific way. So that's why realism deals with middle class people and it's pragmatic, but naturalism deals with middle or lower class people and tries to be scientific. Whereas realism follows is usually psychological, naturalism is usually sociological, and whereas realism usually falls within the tradition of mimetic art, naturalism usually falls within the tradition of investigative art. Realism is usually objective but ethical. Naturalism is usually objective and amoral, in the sense that naturalism does not wish to give a moral judgment on the stories that it tells. It just presents the stories almost in a scientific fashion and does not make a judgment or give a moral judgment on these stories. Realism is usually sometimes comical or satirical. Naturalism is usually pessimistic and sometimes comical, right? How can usually realism deals with questions like how the individual can live within an influenced society. How can an individual live in a society and influence this society? In naturalism, the question is, how does society or the environment impact the individual? And they try to capture it almost as accurately as possible. In the realist tradition, we can name giant novelists, big novelists like Honoré de Balzac, like Gustave Flaubert in the French tradition, George Eliot in England, William Howells, Mark Twain in America, Leo Tolstoy in Russia, and George Sand in the Anglophone tradition. In the naturalist school, we can mention also again giant, big naturalist novelists like Emile Zola in France, Fyodor Dostoevsky in Russia, Thomas Hardy in England, Stephen Crane and Theodore Dreiser. What evolved from these two schools probably is a great tradition of realism that became known as social realism. In a way, it blends realism and naturalism together, and it became known as social realism. They are essentially social or sociological novels that deal with the nature, function, and effects of the society which the characters inhabit, often for the purpose of effecting reform. So basically, they present social issues. They are very big on social issues, with the condition of workers, laborers, especially as they evolved in the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created factories and big industrial farming and things like that. So there is a huge working class that emerged in Europe and America. And social realism is a tradition of the novel that tries to deal with their social issues, the social issue of these average laborers, workers. There was a great tradition of novels that emerged during the Depression years in the United States. In England, we have people like Charles Dickens, who is a giant in the tradition of social realism. We mentioned, for example, his novel Hard Times. We have Gaskell's Mary Barton. We have George Eliot's Middlemarch, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. These are all very famous novels in the social realist tradition. In the United States also, social realism made a name and a tradition for itself, but in the United States, of course, the social realist novel had to deal with the issues of the United States, and here we find the issue of slavery and race as an important issue that social realism in the novel deals with. So we mentioned, for example, Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin as a social realist novel. In the 20th century, we have novels by Wright and Ellison. Social realism also produced type of novels that are in a way a tradition of muckrakers. Muckrakers are in a way rebels. They're rebels who expose corruption in industry or in society or in government. So we have, for example, Steinbeck's Cannery Row or Sinclair's The Jungle are examples of muckraker social realist novel. There also, in the social realist tradition, there are novels that are characterized by being propaganda novels that advocate a specific political tradition. So they advocate a doctrinaire solution to social problems. They present certain social problems and then advocate a political solution to these novels. We mentioned, for example, Godwin's Things as They Are, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged as examples of this social realist tradition of the novel that's characterized by being a propaganda. Some of the greatest novelists of note that we need to be aware of are people like Charles Dickens. He was born in 1812 and died in 1870. This is the grand years of the English novel. The novel, of course, reaches its peak here. It acquires the biggest audience that literature had ever been able to develop. Poetry and the drama could never develop a readership or an audience as big as the audience that the novel has in the 19th century with writers like Charles Dickens. He includes varieties of poor people in all his novels. All Charles Dickens novels have a variety of really very poor people. Charles Dickens brought the problems of poverty to the attention of the readers. So when you read his novels, you get a sense, a very detailed description of the poverty that people lived in, for example, in London in the 19th century. It is scarcely, this is a critic saying this about Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, he says, "It is scarcely conceivable that anyone should exert a stronger social influence than Mr. Dickens has. His sympathies are on the side of the suffering and the frail, and this makes him the idol of those who suffer from whatever cause." So Charles Dickens was a champion of poor people. He wanted to attract attention to the difficulties and the hardships of poor people. Harriet Martineau in the London Times called him preeminently a writer of the people and for the people, and the great commoner of English fiction. Dickens primarily aimed at arousing the conscience of the age, He wanted to arouse the conscience, damir, of the age. To his success in doing so, a non-conformist preacher paid the following tribute. He said, "There have been at work among us 3 great social agencies: the London City Mission, the novels of Mr. Dickens, and the cholera. The cholera is a disease, the novels of Charles Dickens, and the London City Mission." These 3 things, he said, were very instrumental in raising consciousness about the problem of poverty and the hardship of the poor. A very important school in the novel that we should be aware of is the Russian school. The Russian school is extremely important because most English and French and German novels have been influenced by the Russian school of the novel. It develops in Russia from 1850, so the middle of the 19th century, to 1920. This period is a period of great social, political, and existential struggles in Russia. Writers and thinkers remain divided. Some writers try to incite revolution, while others romanticize the past as a time of harmonious order and security, and so on. The novel in Russia embodied these struggles and conflicts in some of the greatest books, the greatest novels ever written in history. The characters in the works search for meaning in an uncertain world. It's a world that's uncertain, and the characters search for meaning, while the novelists who created them experiment with modes of artistic expression to represent the troubled spirit of their age. So it's a new age. There is a lot of upheavals, a lot of political instability, and the novelists try to search for new modes of expression to succeed in capturing the instabilities of their time and express it in ways that can be understood. Some of the greatest Russian novelists, we cannot fail to mention, of course, the most important 2, Leo Tolstoy, who was born in 1828 and died in 1910. He wrote some extremely famous novels like The Cossacks, Anna Karenina, the famous War and Peace, and Resurrection. And of course we cannot forget the giant of the novel, Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was born in 1821 and died in 1881. He wrote some great novels, some extremely famous novels like The Gambler, Crime and Punishment, notes from underground, and of course the brothers Karamazov. So this hopefully would give you a bird's view, a general outline of the novels and novel writing in the Western European tradition, from the emergence of the novel, from the forefathers, the first people who started writing novels, to the people who turned it into an extremely successful and popular genre like Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Charles Dickens. I hope this has been useful, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.